One must not flirt with one's destiny.
I'm just a patsy.
I wonder what happened to the one from last year. Each year we spend good money on these things. Come out here and the one from last year's gone. Yeah, a little spit and polish, you can clean this up. Sell it next year.
So you try to pay me flattery, telling me that I'm a dreamer. Well, I do dream. Dreams that you could never guess.
I haven't seen you in church lately.
All right, Vince, hit him in the head, right between the eyes.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure to talk. I assume it's a great pleasure to talk to Jasun Horsley, a very interesting writer that I have discovered, I think quite a few years ago when I was listening to the Subliminal Jihad podcast. And I think you were a guest, and you were talking about 16 Maps of Hell and about Roman Polanski and all that stuff, and all of that stuff was new to me, and it was very interesting. But at the time, I couldn't get a copy of 16 Maps of Hell because it was sold out, and I got one this last year. I got one in 2025, finally, and read it then. But the first book I read of yours was Seen and Not Seen. And that was very interesting to me. I read it 2 years ago. And after I read it, I had wanted to get in touch because it was uncanny how much the book had to do with me. And I mean, we certainly had a different upbringing and so on, but there were so many parallels. And what this book did was to formulate a dilemma that I had. I used to be a cinephile, I used to be a film critic, and I wanted to make movies, and I wrote screenplays, and didn't have that much success. I mean, of course, as a film critic, it's fairly easy to get published at some point and to connect with other cinephiles and other film critics, and you can go that path quite easily. But the other thing, a career in the movies, that's another thing. But at the same time, I had that nagging feeling, this dilemma, because I was used to an environment where art in general was considered a good thing, always a good thing. Art is something that enlightens us. And if it's art that, even if it's quite harmful, there's a lesson in there, and it's always good. Even if it traumatizes you, there's a lesson in there. It's always good. If you don't respond to that, you might be not intellectually ready just yet. So, um, and I've met those cinephiles who can just watch about anything and see value in every movie, and those people, they wanna it feels like they want to be traumatized by a movie. They want to be shaken. I don't know, they want the movie to penetrate them and their thoughts. And at some point I just couldn't do it anymore, because at some point I thought it wasn't healthy, especially when those films come, I mean, from a place like Hollywood, which does collaborate with the military and the intelligence services, and it shows. And especially today, we have all the evidence. We have all those books, by David Robb or by Trisha Jenkins or by Matt Elford, and we know of the connections of the Hollywood connections to government entities. And we know of government connections to the mob. And you are talking about that in 60 Maps of Hell as well. I just started to question my relationship to films, and I started to question the place where all those films come from and what it does to you. You have done so much work on that. And I never saw someone really write about his moral dilemmas with movies. And I never met anyone who loved movies, but who started to question his own love for them and his own infatuation and obsession. And that was very interesting to me because when you step aside a bit, when you don't watch a movie every day, when you try to live a little, and it's like, it's like coming down. It's you're not addicted anymore, and then you start to get an outer perspective, and you see what it actually does to you. I have to say, when I was watching one movie a day, I wasn't a very happy person. It was like a coping mechanism. It was like something I had to do. And while watching a movie, it was all fine. But in between, it wasn't that fine. I never found anybody who could relate, really. I started out questioning all of that. So far, I think you're the only writer who tried to investigate all his doubts about films and his own pleasure in watching films. That's of course only one aspect, but I think that's the one that resonated with me the most.
Mm. Well, a couple of things around this. The thing that you chose to focus on, one is that I just completed a book actually. On New Year's Day was my deadline. It's a book about the Bible, scripture. So I've moved away from what I call mapping hell, and but I just mention it because I thought I more or less had all of the content for the book, like from writing at Children of Job, and I knew I would do some rewriting, but I thought essentially I had what I needed for the book. It's a short book, but once I was embarking upon it, I realized very quickly that I didn't, and by the time I had finished what I thought was the book and printed it out, reading it back, I realized it was very, very far from finished, and I had to find ways to bring it to life. It's like Frankenstein's monster, I had all of the body parts and I stitched it together, but it was just a corpse. And the only way to bring it to life was to find really what the book was about and the reason for writing it here at this very last moment, like 2 days before or a week before I was submitting it. It's not usually that extreme, but all of my books have had that element in them whereby when I start them, I think I'm doing one thing, and by the time I finish them, I'm doing another. And then when I'm actually trying to rewrite and polish them, it just keeps changing and changing. And I'm trying to get to the real reason that I wrote the book, which is what's happening for me in my own life at that time. And the reason for writing the book is what can happen in my consciousness by writing it. It's a bit circular, but then if I can capture what is happening in my consciousness by writing the book in the book, then the book is complete. Now, and I think that, I know that Seen and Not Seen was the first time that happened, and I haven't been able to repeat the ease with which I wrote Seen and Not Seen. It was the easiest book I ever wrote, and it shows. I think when I read it back, it's the easiest to read. It flows. It's not clunky. It has this very good balance between personal voice and personal life story and analysis. It's just all very well woven together, and the reason for that is because it began as a response to Jonathan Lethem through email. Not that I was writing chapter-long emails, but I mean, we made contact through email because of the Philip K. Dick piece that I wrote, and then I read his The Disappointment Artist, and it's in Seen Not Seen, and I was writing the chapters of the book with him in mind, including chapters about his work, right? So that sense of having a dialogue really allowed me to find my voice, I think. But as I say, I wasn't able to recreate that afterwards. No book I've written since then has had this first reader who was a famous author, and there was just something very inspiring and emotionally gratifying about that. But leaving that aside, it set the template for writing as a process of self-discovery. The other thing that I wanted to mention in response is that when I wrote Seen and Not Seen, I did think there must be loads of guys, not women, out there who are going to respond to this, who must feel the same way, who love movies, and have a certain paranoid awareness, and therefore are also interested in looking more critically at movies, or looking at them in a new context. I thought there must be thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of guys like that who grew up on Taxi Driver, who read Pauline Kael, Clint Eastwood, whatever it was, the various things that I chose to focus on because of my own story. I knew that they were very widespread, these interests, anyway, but I was very naive because of all my books, it's the one that sold the least. I just got a check, actually, not a check, whatever, a PayPal, last week for Seen and Not Seen. I think it was £20, and that was probably the first in 2 years or something. So, don't bother becoming a writer, anyone who's listening to this, just forget about it. But Seen and Not Seen is extreme. Like, I don't know, maybe it sold 200 copies or something, which is nothing, right? And even in terms of, like, I have a fairly large audience through the internet. I mean, well, relatively small, but still relatively large compared to 200 copies of Seen and Not Seen. And they don't seem particularly interested. Like, hardly anyone ever mentions it. I hardly ever did any interviews about Seen and Not Seen. So what is it about that book, even though it's definitely close to my personal favourite, certainly in the top 3, and I think it's the most accessible of all the books I've read. Like, it's not the only one my sister has read twice, and she's whatever. She doesn't like deep analysis and research and stuff. So it is accessible, but there's something about it which makes it difficult, I suppose, for people to connect to. And maybe it's what you're talking about, that nobody or very few people want to think about or really confront their ambivalence. It's in the first quote in 60 Maps of Hell, the Montaigne, we're divided in ourselves, within us when it comes to the things that we love. Because can we continue to love them if we begin to see that they're in some way harmful to us? I'm just guessing that must have something to do with it. And there are certainly plenty of researchers out there and writers who write about movies, well, Psyop Cinema being the obvious example. Currently, for me, it's obvious, because I have a collaboration with them. And by the way, if you haven't read it, The Moviegoer in the first issue of Cultural Engineering Studies is very much in the style of Seen and Not Seen, or not exactly the style, but it really picks up on the themes of that book. And then 60 Maps of Hell, it's very much a companion piece to those two books, so I recommend it, or to listeners if you haven't read it. And that's back to this same ambivalence I have, and trying to look at really the dark agendas behind the movies that we consider are great or that have influenced us. And but anyway, I was going to just make the point that Psyop Cinema or somebody like Jay Dyer or other movie not critics but analysts who are analysing from a frame of what I call paranoid awareness, they don't address this, generally speaking. They tend to just talk, or Matthew Alford, who mentioned these guys, they just talk about the ways in which movies are tools of cultural engineering and therefore basically are bad. That there isn't, I find it frustrating because they don't seem to be wrestling with this same cognitive dissonance that to this day, and this is kind of the last thing I was going to say, you've got me at a funny time because it's just come through Christmas. So I have been watching movies every day. For the last few weeks, I've re-immersed in my addiction because I still love movies. I haven't found very many good ones, needless to say. But so that's a lesson, a cautionary tale with all that I've uncovered and discovered. It hasn't entirely cured me, and I don't know, what the reason for that is, and whether the guys, Thomas and Brett, for example, who do Psyop Cinema, they tend to just they will acknowledge a movie has qualities. But they're just doing this series on Oliver Stone. I don't actually agree with their evaluation often. Like, I don't think Oliver Stone did many good movies really at all, although I do think he's interesting. But there's a certain compartmentalization there which I can't really do. So for me, still, a movie like Taxi Driver, let's say, to use an easy example, even if you could prove, and I wish you could, in a way, that it was consciously created as a psychological weapon for cultural engineering, the lone nut, and this, that, and the other, and the way that the Psyop cinemas guys like to do, you still have to address the fact that something is coming through that movie, or these movies, some of them, that has a genuinely inspired quality. So I'm going to say, just to round up, that to this day, and I'm becoming actually less hardline about it, really, I cannot separate in the work the benign from the malign. You can trace certain things and you can see, well, Bryan Singer, for example. I just wouldn't watch Bryan Singer movies. Well, because they're all about superheroes and so on. Of course, he's been cancelled now. But I mean, when it's so obvious that somebody is just a nasty piece of work and complicit with the worst kind of crimes, and their movies are basically superficial anyway, even if they're entertaining, it's relatively easy. Or Woody Allen, well, he hasn't made a good movie in 20 years anyway, so it's pretty easy to just say, okay, forget about Woody Allen. But Ari Aster would be a good current example. I just watched Eddington, which I loved the first half hour of, or even the first hour. I thought it was an amazingly effective piece, and then it went into ultra-violence and stuff. But he's a good example. Or the Begonia. I said I was winding up, but again, once I get rolling, it's tricky to wind up. The Lobster filmmaker, whose name I never remember, I thought Begonia was quite interesting, but that was also produced by Ari Aster. And so they seem, with Emma Stone and various others, they seem to be the sort of alternate Hollywood group who are addressing some of the woke stuff directly or indirectly, and seeming to present a more cogent or a more sentient or more intelligent form of filmmaking. However, Ari Aster also did Midsummer, which was just trash, but then he did, before that, Heritage, which is an example, or was it called Heritage? Or
Hereditary.
Hereditary, which is an example of what you're saying, people who want to be traumatized by a movie. Well, that will do it, right? So that's a movie that I would say is good enough to be evil in some way. Like, it's so effective, I'd say that's a harmful movie. People probably shouldn't watch it, really. I wouldn't bother to tell them not to, but if I had a child or daughter, I would say, you can't watch that till you're 18 or something. And so, but we're back to this ambivalence thing. It was effective, so it was bordering on art, but it was pernicious. So then art is neutral, finally. Art doesn't have a virtue, it doesn't have an obligation to be virtuous. But I would say that we've lost that. Like somebody like Roger Scruton talked about this, like beauty. Hereditary is only beautiful in a very nihilistic way, really. It's beautiful because the editing and the cinematography, they know what they're doing. But it doesn't have beauty in a deep, John Keats sense, as in it's representing truth and goodness. Far from it, right? It's actually beautifying something that's evil. So I think that's probably a good place to end on, because I think that's the fundamental problem with the arts and the movies, is that they have, since the New Hollywood, when things got really good, they've been beautifying the ugly, and that itself is morally problematic.
A couple of things. I also was watching quite a few movies in those days, around Christmas, because I had some time on my hands, and but I was wrestling with that because I'm in a weird stage where I still kind of love movies, but sometimes I think it's all just a waste of my time, and I sometimes I just can't decide what film to watch because I'm so fed up with everything. But I still, I mean, I watch films also for research. Like I watched the new Seymour Hersh documentary Cover Up, which was as expected, some limited hangout thing. Because it's Laura Poitras, I mean, she does these films because she's got the access, and she she just plays the game very well. I don't even think that she's necessarily compromised, although probably she is, but she doesn't have to be because she just plays the game so well. She has the most interesting subjects and makes the most boring films about them, which is kind of a, I mean, it's a talent. It's really a talent. She's got access to the Edward Snowden story, and then she makes this non-entity of a film that doesn't really provide any insight. Or I don't know if you know the story about her Assange documentary, which was supposed to be quite a positive portrayal of him and his work, and then came some of the allegations, and then she changed her initial cut and made a different film. And I think this is so interesting because this is what lots of filmmakers do because they're aware of it, especially documentary filmmakers. I think the documentary is one of the most problematic uh, forms of cinema out there because it comes with so many misconceptions and people perceive it as the real thing. And it's basically, most of the time, it's a reenactment. It's a reenactment, it's fictitious, and it's got this narrative. And a narrative is, of course, necessary because film needs structure. But that's what makes it a story. That's what makes fiction out of nonfiction. It's the narrative, it's the structure. But I mean, all those professional filmmakers, they know that, and they use it to their advantage. But I think it's a shame because Seymour Hersh is quite an interesting guy, and of course he wasn't very honest in this documentary. He tells these stories like, oh, I just met this general on a hallway, and then he mentioned the first name, and then I started digging, and I found his story, and of course that's not the whole story, of course.
Mm.
And also, the dog doesn't go into the whole. He got $1 million advance for his Dark Side of Camelot book, for example.
My
And
God.
uh,
I tossed that aside, actually. I think I mentioned it in a recent podcast. I bought it recently, and then I saw right in the intro that he dismissed any conspiracy around JFK's murder. So I thought, I'm not going to read this book. There's no, what's the point? He's
really,
obviously lying, yeah.
and he almost fell for a forged letter. That was supposed to. I don't know who was supposed to have written it, but it was about the Kennedy brothers killing Marilyn Monroe, and that was a forgery. And I think he paid a lot of money for that, and it almost got in the book.
Mm,
But then it came out and it didn't, but it made some headlines back in the day. And
right.
he had to justify himself. And and this part of the story never gets mentioned. We see his office, which is full of documents, and you think, now this is an earnest guy. This is a workhorse. This is a down-to-earth guy. But you never mention the money, and this is like a hidden theme of many biographies and many works of art. It's the money. Yeah, but it takes away the pleasure of it all. And I understand. That's why we don't want to hear about it. You were talking about the paranoid awareness. And I think maybe that was for me the key to your book. Because for me, the first time it was reading Anthony Summers' book about JFK, which is not the best book, but it's a start, for someone who doesn't know anything about the case. And that kind of shook me up, but then I forgot about it. And some years later, I read The President and the Provocateur by Alex Cox because I was a fan of Alex Cox films. And therefore, I was interested what he had to say because I watched Oliver Stone's JFK, I read Summers' book, and then I saw his book, which was like a parallel biography of Lee Harvey Oswald and John F. Kennedy, which basically was just a summation of the research that we know, but it was an interesting juxtaposition and was quite a good book. That's the ironic thing because I got sucked into conspiracy themes and stories through movies. And through Oliver Stone, through Alex Cox, and some of the Italian political thrillers that I was mentioning in my email,
Yeah.
Francesco Rosi and people like that. And the difference between me and my cinephile friends, they watched all those movies and then they let it go, but I couldn't let it go. I thought to myself, this is the real deal. This is where the money is. This is the interesting story. I mean, why is no one talking about that? I mean, this is about the fabric of our society. This is about how the stories we tell ourselves are lies, basically. Isn't that interesting? I thought it was so funny because no one is really interested in questioning the fabric of society. I mean, people are quick to dismiss, I don't know, Nazis or people they perceive as Nazis, but they don't think about where do they come from? Nazis are reactionaries. Reaction to what? Maybe there's some things going on in the mainstream in the status quo, but people do tend to compartmentalize those issues. They never try to see the big picture, or they never try to connect things. What if it's all connected? What if one depends on the other?
Yeah. Well, you are describing the paranoid worldview. I mean, that sees it all as all connected. And so when you say that people never do this, and you're talking about a particular set of people, maybe you're thinking of your family or these fellow cinephiles, but you've obviously spent plenty of time researching now, so you couldn't not be aware of what I call the second matrix, which is where people are all too aware of these things and they're all too busy joining the dots, and they think I would say they overestimate their ability to join the dots, and so they become too quickly satisfied with a worldview that is the opposite of the one that you were just denouncing or criticizing. I can't help but thinking of James Dalrymple now, because he had me on his podcast, which is a bit of a surprise at all, really, because he's relatively mainstream, for 16 Maps of Hell. I thought we got on fairly well. Anyway, I interacted with him on Substack briefly because I can't remember who got whose attention, but it was the thing about C.S. Lewis anyway that he hadn't written but he linked to. He was saying, look, C.S. Lewis was dirty, here's the evidence. And I said, well, it's a bit tenuous. Like it was circumstantial, and it was by association, it was guilt by association. And I'm not defending C.S. Lewis. I'm nobody's fan, but I do admire his sci-fi novels. And to me, you've got to do a very thorough job if you're going to start pointing the finger, and that includes looking at the writing itself, as I did with Aleister Crowley and The Vice of Kings, or Whitley Strieber with Prison Infinity. If you can use the person's writing or their output to expose them, then you've done a good job, right? Because you're using the very evidence that other people are using to prove that they're good to show that they're not good. Then, right, people can still argue because they can just disagree, but they can't say that you're jumping to conclusions or that the evidence you're using is circumstantial, because it's right there in the work itself. Anyway, I just went off on a tangent, but the point I was going to make about relates to C.S. Lewis was with Dalrymple. He sent me to an essay he had written, and the gist of it was this. It was what I'm saying. It was essentially, well, let's stop pretending we don't know that the world is run by Luciferian pedophiles. And I'm like, what does that even mean? Do you even know what Luciferian means? Right? He's not using it in a historical context. Pedophile's a whole other thing. I mean, that word's misused as well. So I made a comment. So when you have this very broad world view, and then you use it as a lens by which, or a brush by which to paint people, anyone you come across such as C.S. Lewis, then you get close to scapegoating, because you can't. I mean, you just can't do that. You have to take each case. What he was arguing was, we've got enough evidence now. We know the way the world works, and therefore we can just assume. You don't have to start pretending. It was almost like it was a. I think he sent it to me specifically because he disagrees with my approach, which is an attempt to be balanced and to be fair and to acknowledge the first matrix frame while we're looking at the second matrix frame. So anyway, I'm just using him as example. I mean, the larger point I want to make has to do with this original thing that you brought up, which I refer to as cognitive dissonance. If we're not wrestling with our own confusion and uncertainty and ambivalence around the evidence that we're uncovering, then I don't think we're being honest. We're taking refuge in some sort of unearned certainty, because nobody understands the way that the world works. And David Icke and Alex Jones and James Delingpole, or even somebody who's relatively better like Michael A. Hoffman, or I don't know about Jay Dyer, but whatever. You can't. I don't want to make the same mistake by grouping them all together. But generally speaking, conspiracy theorists, as I said about with the movie stuff, they compartmentalize, and you can gather an awful lot of evidence that the world is the way it is, and I've done that in my books, but it's never enough to completely sweep away all the other evidence that convinced us that the world was a different way until we started looking for the cracks, right? So we've got this picture that's been created by the superculture, and then there are these cracks in it, or we make cracks ourselves, the anomalies. We start to peer through, and we see the superculture, that's behind that's through the cracks in the culture that the superculture has created. We start to glimpse the superculture, and then we try and fill in the gaps and say, okay, this is the reality, and we're trying to describe the superculture, but you can't. By definition, it's this thing we're embedded in, so you can't actually get the full picture, and the only way you do it is by the second matrix model. You essentially reformat everything you can see in the culture through the paradigm of the superculture, which is, as I say, is always partial, and you end up with it's all evil. You end up essentially from red pill to black pill, which I've certainly I get close to that in many ways, and I've been quite extremist in my points of view. But the way I look at it now is it's more of a psychological necessity by which we're able to create a kind of field of skepticism and unsuspend our disbelief, and just start not rejecting everything, but you said it earlier about standing back from things, pushing things far enough away that we can at least begin to see what it might be without their influence. But at a certain point, you can't actually completely dismiss them. You can't actually completely define them as evil just because we thought they were good, and now we realize they're not good. We want to define them as evil. That doesn't work either. So that's kind of where I'm at currently. I'm becoming a lot less categorical about these things, and I wonder if, like you're saying about these documentary filmmakers, that they can just take a position whereby they don't need to be recruited or co-opted or compromised. They just say, well, this is going to work better. So that it's moral relativity, and it's postmodern, and it's this and it's that, right? And they have the rationale, perhaps, well, I can never represent the absolute objective truth anyway. It's always going to be a narrative. So why not tweak it here and why not tweak it there? Now, that is unethical in general, I think, but it's definitely unethical if they're doing it because they want to have a more successful product. But I do wonder, as I become more flexible myself in my own cognitive apprehension and whatnot of these things, not if they're right, but if there isn't some similarity essentially between that and where I am at currently, which is accepting that I can't be the judge of these things. I don't have the knowledge and I don't have all the evidence. And so, yeah, what's the difference between moral relativity, which I'd say is a slippery slope and an error, and what I call liminality, just remaining liminal and admitting that I don't know. I really don't know. I don't even know if Satan exists, is anything other than a necessary function of the metaphysical order of existence, right? You go at the deepest, highest level, I don't know if evil doesn't serve a purpose. So then when you get all the way down in the trenches, all I can say then is, well, what's right for me? And there I have to admit that I'm not being as impeccable as I would like. I'm still watching movies.
I try to work, on a case-by-case basis because I don't have a complete worldview because, the longer I investigate one topic, the more I realize I don't know that much about it, and there's still a lot more to learn. And sometimes when I look too close, I find myself coming to totally different conclusions than when I started out. And I must assume if I took the time, I would experience that with every subject. When you look close enough, everything's different than you assume. But you can't. I mean, that's the human mind has limits, and we don't have enough time. So I got humbled by research. I must say. I'm investigating certain aspects of the Oklahoma City bombing, and because there's a German connection. And, I started out thinking, oh, I know what this is. But the more I look into it, I had to change my mind, and now I'm very uncertain what it is I'm actually looking at. But that's the trap. I think this is always the trap when you deal in conspiracies or parapolitics, because there's just so much that you don't know, and then you tend to assume based on based on your knowledge, based on existing history, but it might as well be wrong.
Mm.
So it's very difficult, and
It is. Well, I'll just interrupt to say, I mean, this is back to or it relates to what I said at the beginning of why all the books I write and all the pieces I write, I try to include the personal element of why I'm looking into this and what's going on for me as I look into it, whatever it is. Because I think, I'm pretty sure that in lieu of the possibility of certainty or knowing for sure, anything for sure, the only thing that we have is honesty, is being honest about what we know and what we don't know. And that is possible. It's extremely hard, and I don't just mean because it's uncomfortable being honest, but I mean it's extremely hard. The way that we've been trained or programmed or conditioned or educated, we can't think clearly enough to be honest. So there's all kinds of ways in which there is pressure to assume more certainty and conviction than we have in order just to be effective in the world. Because if you're always saying, well, I don't really know because I haven't done enough research, which is honest, then the person who's not honest and thinks that they do know because they think they have done enough research is just going to steamroll right over you, right? Like Delingpole with his, well, we all know that Luciferian pedophiles run the world, so just shut up, and get with the program, get with the second matrix. You're always at a disadvantage in a culture that rewards, let's say, dishonesty or unearned convictions. So, but as I say, it is possible. It's a discipline, and it requires, like the way that I experience it, is really checking every statement that I'm making, including when I'm speaking, of course, but certainly when I'm writing. And now, so for example, writing about, if I'm writing a book about God, the mimetic God is this latest book, well, obviously, I mean, that's the highest, deepest subject possible, and therefore the most essential that I admit at the beginning, in the middle, and the end. I don't know, much about God, because nobody does. Right. So then, but then a level down, I'm writing about religious faith and my personal relationship to these things, and then I'm writing about scripture, and then I'm writing about the interpretations of scripture. There's these different levels, and you can say with authority and confidence and conviction, earned conviction. It says this in the Bible, this translation, right? You know what you're talking about if you're just talking about the text. Then when you say, well, somebody interpreted it this way, also you've got the book and you're just stating a fact. Then when you say that you interpret it this way, well, you just making clear this is just your interpretation, and so on. It gets tricky when you talk about the history of scripture. I'm just using this as an example. So if we go back to film, if you just study the films themselves, it's clear, unless you get into some quantum mechanical, new age view that the movie changes, which I did theorize about The Shining, with every person who sees it. But leaving that aside, we've got this fixed object, and we can agree more or less what's there. But then you talk about the history of the movie, then it starts to become subjective. Then you talk about the hidden history of the characters involved in the movie and their connections to intelligence and organized crime. You're getting murkier and murkier as you proceed. So acknowledging that, and the thing about the murkiness is that it's becoming more and more subjective, and therefore our perception, this could get postmodern, but I don't mean it to, our perception becomes more and more central to what we're seeing, right? So then the subjective element becomes more and more necessary, and that's where the honesty, I think, you have to level up with honesty. Being not you personally, but I feel I have to be as honest as possible about what's going on for me around these subjects. So Seen and Not Seen, Confessions of a Movie Autist. Well, that wasn't a fanciful title. It is confessional. I confess to some very unpleasant things in there because I had to, essentially.
Yeah, we should go back to the book in a second. I just wanted to say there's also the element of group pressure, because Dave McGowan is considered a hero, like in certain circles, and I have to say I wrestle with that, because many people that I respect and that I trust more or less, they consider him a hero. But I, having read him, I think he's deeply problematic, because the first book I read was Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. I think this is the lesser book, but it helped me to see what problems Program to Kill initially had. Because he does these connections. It's interesting to read this book, and not being an American or something like that, because for me, talking about Satan and Satanism, it's not that common. This is not a thing in Germany. Nobody talks about Satan or Satanism. This is a book that comes from a certain culture that can easily relate to these ancient terms, good and evil, God, Satan, satanic pedophiles, whatever. But for me, it was completely new, and I just didn't see that connection. And when some event happened around April 20th, not even on April 20th, Hitler's birthday, but just around. For me, this is not evidence of anything. So, and I think this is where culture comes in. I don't come from this culture where I can easily accept this as evidence or as fact or as anything. Also, there are some things that I noticed that nobody really talks about, like in Program to Kill. There's this one time McGowan mentions Hermann Hesse. I don't know if you ever read Hermann Hesse, the German writer, and he describes him as an occult writer. And for me, this is so funny, because Hermann Hesse is read in school. He's, you could call him or some of his work esoteric, but he's far from being occult. He's like, he's got more to do with people like Eckhart Tolle, for example, just as a fiction writer. But calling him an occult writer, that was really funny to me. And it just shows that this level of, it's a certain level of delusion, I have to say. And I do respect some of the things in the book. or the way he describes the death of Pier Paolo Pasolini, the Italian director. And he tried to connect this to some occult date. And and that was kind of lazy because there are far more credible theories about his death because he published shortly before his death he published like a column in a newspaper where he said, I know who is responsible for the bombing at Piazza Fontana and so on. And he was talking about Gladio before Gladio was a thing. And he was writing a novel in that regard. And shortly after they killed him. And what we know today is that it was assassination. It wasn't just just a young male prostitute. It wasn't just a dispute for money or something. That was a hit. So, but according to Dave McGowan, it had something to do with some occult date. And seeing that over and over again in his work, it just made me very suspicious. And you see it more in Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. Um, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon is like, for me, it's like the Laurel Canyon music version of Hollywood Babylon, a bit, because there are all those stories and rumors, but he doesn't even try to fact check them. You know, what you do in 60 Maps of Hell, you try to make sure this is well documented. But he just took every story that he could find, every story that looked remotely suspicious about any of those musicians, and took it in there, and it just fit a certain worldview. Like this ludicrous story about how Jim Morrison wrote all of the Doors songs before he met the band. Where does that come from? And of
Hmm.
course, he doesn't state where that does come from. And I don't think it's true. And I think there's enough documentation, and those
Mm.
musicians, those colleagues of him, they were talented enough. It's just a very weird thing to say, but it does fit his theory that the Doors was just an op, And I mean, it's kind of entertaining to read, but it's lazy in the end, and I think that's a shame because there are so many interesting things in that book, like the hippie movement being like a psyop to divert from the actual peace movement. Now that is a great idea, but this is only like 4 or 5 pages in the book. This should have been the book, but the rest is just rumors and tabloid stuff and the usual occult dates. Again, with my perspective, I just couldn't see what he saw. So I know exactly what you mean when you tell about, when people they just switch sides, and good is bad and bad is good. It's too easy. It's too
Yeah.
easy because I do believe that the world is more complicated than that, and I don't think that many assets know they are assets. And many people who seem to do work for the government don't actually get paid by the government. They just automatically align with its worldview because it just serves them.
Yeah. A couple of things, just briefly, not to get pulled down this particular rabbit hole, although it is very illustrative of the second Matrix theme in general. Mike Williams and the Beatles thing, which I've disagree with Brett Carollo, Psyop Sinner about, and he doesn't seem to really understand where I'm coming from, but I think it's very, very similar or almost identical with the McGowan problem with scenes, is that Mike Williams and others gather this evidence about the Beatles being a psyop, but it's it's evidence of something, but it's so far from conclusive. But it's arranged in such a way that it can be momentarily persuasive, and then if you really want to be persuaded, or if it fits with your already growing worldview, then right, if the shoe fits, you go to the dance. And I put my conversation with Mike Williams at the on YouTube, which I don't usually do. I don't use my YouTube channel, and it gets comments every week. And what I've noticed is they're completely split. It's always totally for or it's totally against. There's hardly anything in between, or I don't think there is anything in between. There's people just saying, this is so obvious, you stupid people, that the Beatles is a psyop, and then there's people saying, this is ridiculous, there's no evidence whatsoever, blah, 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 right? And the thing is I can see both points of view, and that's actually interesting. That makes the whole thing worth considering and researching, but it requires remaining liminal, right? Being able to perceive both points of view. The alternative is schismogenesis, and that I think is really central to what's going on. Is that the narratives are created, and then the counter narratives are created, and then they're pitted against each other, and they reinforce each other, and people are herded and they're corralled, and people double down one way or another. But it doesn't lead to anything. It doesn't lead anywhere.
But let's go back to the book. This is kind of a provocative question, but it's one that I also pose to myself. Did you try to justify your failure as a filmmaker by rejecting the movies on a philosophical level? Because that was what I was asking myself. Did I do that? Did I try to find a justification why I just couldn't get in the door? Did you ever ask yourself that, whether you unconsciously try to justify this experience?
Yeah. Well, yes, certainly. I would have thought it's certainly in 16 Mountains of Hell, this question. I would have thought it was in Seen and Not Seen. I'm sure it must be. I think it's subtler, and there's more to it. There's more nuance, and there's more variables. And maybe I can get to them, but I just thinking now of a more general point, which is back to the McGowan problem. It's really very obvious, apparent to me, that in the culture at large, this tendency to demonize, if that's the right word, because you can't really demonize demons, so some of it is accurate, but to oversimplify the malevolent nature of culture, popular culture, is clearly a way for people to feel better about their own lack of success within it. I mean, I think that seems to be indisputable. I mean, I know that because I could see it myself. Like, my desire to want to destroy all my own idols is partly desire to get to the truth. Just want to make that clear. That's the main impetus, and that's the one that I trust in. But it's also partly a desire to relieve the tension of envy. It's very hard to, particularly now I'm old enough to really accept I'm never going to be the cultural genius I thought I would be. I'll never be recognised as that. And I had an upbringing where that really was instilled into me, like what you were saying, all art is good, and that the highest achievement in life is to be a great artist, and so on. So it has been a difficult process to let go of that, and it has been helpful letting go of it to discover, I would say, that it is a kind of club which the kind of things you have to do to join it are things I would not want to do, and I don't want to be willing to do. Whether I would have done them earlier on if I'd had the opportunity or not is a moot question. I mean, I have, as I write about in Seen Not Seen, and even in my latest book, it keeps resurfacing my brother's example in terms of, like, of course I don't know exactly what my brother was involved in, and I don't know, there could have been some conscious recruitment going on, I mean, on both sides, but from what I was able to observe, it's what you were talking about. It's a case of somebody who is signalling in the right, giving the right signals, so that the culture, the superculture, little by little is giving them opportunities, and then seeing how they perform. Now, one doesn't have to be conspiratorial here, because obviously the marketplace does that. A record producing company takes a chance on a band and funds a record to see how it sells, and if it sells well, they get more funding, right? There's nothing conspiratorial or mysterious or sinister about that. But this is, at a deeper level, which does involve intelligence services and military agendas and psychological operations, whereby are they going to justify the time and the money invested in them isn't just whether they make money. There are these other variables. Are they going to be effective as cultural engineering agents, let's say, to keep it in the terminology of paranoid awareness? And so I can look at my brother's life through that lens, that he was on the verge of some big success, his best-selling memoir, and it's about moral turpitude, and it's about hedonism and nihilism and postmodernism and self-revenge. I mean, he was almost proto-woke. He would have absolutely hated woke, but he himself said, I am what I say I am. I'm my own invention. That no one is real. Everyone's a fake. But I'm a fake who knows he's a fake. It was very compatible with a kind of woke ideology. It's just that my brother was the opposite of politically correct. So there's a weird tension there. But certainly in terms of a Luciferian archetypal character for people to emulate, who's all about sex, drugs and rock and roll, kind of literally, and self-destruction, you could see how he was useful, potentially, for agendas. And Stephen Fry is a very fishy character, I would say, with some dubious statements on record about pedophilia and things like that. And obviously, a cultural icon in Britain, was at my brother's funeral, and seemed like a nice guy. Actually, he was the only speech I really appreciated was his, and had optioned my brother's book for a film, which never happened. Would it have happened if he'd died? I don't know. Was his death part of a cultural engineering thing? No, I'm pretty sure it wasn't. Like, somebody looking from the outside might come up with theory. In fact, I even got an email about it a while back. Was your brother murdered? Well, actually, I speculate that in seen and not seen, but not as an assassination, but possibly a very local crime by people who benefited, like his girlfriend and his manager, who got his all of that inheritance. That's possible. But in terms of it being a larger thing, no. I mean, he was a cash cow, and he had more cash in him. His death definitely didn't fit with those plans. It fit with somebody who was actually not made of the right stuff, who wasn't going to really be able to turn themselves into a cultural product. Right? One of the things that killed him was seeing himself portrayed on stage in a London production of his book, and he found it so repellent that he went into kind of despair. So it's like seeing in the mirror. He got to see what he was creating in the mirror, and he didn't like it. I would say that's evidence of integrity. Unfortunately, it was too late, too little too late, and it killed him. But I'm not quite sure what point I make. Oh, you asked this question, right? Yeah, I mean, that's how I look at it with myself, totally independently of a conspiratorial view of the superculture and the culture beneath it or inside it. I certainly confirmed time and again that I'm simply not willing to compromise my own sense of integrity and honesty in order to be successful. I can't even do it on YouTube or Twitter. I can't be bothered to figure out what's going to work, because it's too hard work. I'm not, I'm trying to reduce it to something that isn't particularly virtuous necessarily. It's just inherent to me. It's too difficult to try and pretend to be something I'm not, hoping it will work. I'm just going to carry on trying to be as close to what I think I am as possible, and live with the endless frustration of it not really working, right? Not getting hits, not getting likes, and so on. So I would say that is evidence of integrity, but it's also an autistic quality. I'm just very stubborn, non-cooperative. So it's a mixed bag. But back to your main question, I do think there is a tendency, and I'm guilty of it, to oversimplify and to give in to a desire to want to dismiss all cultural giants, or even, half giants, or what have you, achievers, as compromise as part of a club, because it simplifies one's own either decision not to not be part of it, or failure to be part of it. And I just don't think it's accurate. But or at the very least, if it is accurate, you have to still proceed on a case-by-case basis, and how do we know? Like, I'll give you, it might seem a random example. I was thinking of Nick Cave, first of all, because he was a friend of my brother's, but he didn't come to his funeral. And Nick Cave, I was a fan of Nick Cave in my 20s when he was a marginal character. He became a cultural icon in the last 20 years or something. I guess after my brother knew him, he's become what would you call that? An icon, right? He's been canonized, Nick Cave. He's A-list now, and I did think about contacting him recently because he might remember. Well, obviously, he'd remember my brother, but the reason I did think about this, and also the reason I decided not to, I mean for a podcast, was that I was briefly corresponding with Will. Do you know who Will Oldham is? The Bonnie Prince Billy musician.
Yeah, he was in the first films of Rick Alverson, first couple of films.
Okay.
Yeah, the guy with the beard, he's a musician too. Yeah.
He's a very accomplished musician. He's not A-list, he's not a legend, but he's certainly B-list. He's one of the most respected musicians currently. Anyway, he did answer my email, and we went back and forth, and we were going to do a podcast. And then, hopefully this isn't too irrelevant as an anecdote, and just my way of getting my revenge on Will Oldham. But between us, we got the time wrong by an hour. Although essentially it was his responsibility, because I checked. I said, "Is it this time in Kentucky?" Because there were 2 time zones, and he said, "Yes, that's right. Good on you for diligence." So he essentially got the time wrong. But anyway, because of that, he just dropped out. I mean, he made it seem as though it was my fault, but also as if, well, if you can't even get the time wrong, I'm not going to waste any more time on you. He wasn't like that explicit, but it was implicit. And I thought that must be what being a celebrity is. It turns you into. Like, it was a minor thing. He wasn't horrible about it. It was just the subtle arrogance and the willingness to dismiss and to just cast me aside as an irrelevancy, even if I had got the time wrong, which I hadn't. He did, right? It kind of brought home to me this belief I've had for a very long time, that you can't become a celebrity without somehow losing a part of your soul, which is really, I feel that's oversimplified if I state it that way, and I'm not saying this is proof that Will Oldham has no soul, but at the same time I think it is fairly straightforward that the more of a somebody you become, the more you're surrounded by people telling you you're great, who don't want to piss you off, who want to be sure they can get on your good side or get you on your podcast. I think he was just used to, he just assumed I would grovel and say, "Oh, I'm really sorry, let's try again." But I didn't blame it. I didn't say anything, and then that was it. It was over. So I didn't signal in the right way the reverence and the respect, I think. And I wouldn't. Right, I just wouldn't do that. I'm not going to treat. I mean, one of the reasons I was looking forward to talking to him was that I thought it would be fun for both of us. I'm not going to treat him like he's somebody special, and maybe he'll appreciate that. But anyway, obviously, I calculated wrong. So yeah, that's a much subtler, broader lens. You don't have to get conspiratorial or Jeffrey Epstein or compromat about this. There's something that happens psychologically and energetically as you become compatible to and assimilated by this world, where it changes the qualities in you, and that is compromise, essentially, whether it's involving rituals or initiation or pedophilia or any of that stuff. One is compromising one's sense of what is true. So we're back to this larger question that's in seen and not seen, which is, and I bring it to the broadest possible thing, is there something wrong with art? Period. Like, is it a dissociative strategy that we've learned to cope with trauma? And if so, is there such a thing as too much? Right? A coping strategy is necessary by definition, but if you then turn it into a talent and you turn it into a value system, then you're on your way to being lost.
Yeah, there must be a connection there, because when you look especially at comedians, many comedians, they had a terrible upbringing and a terrible childhood. I mean, many artists in general, but especially comedians, which which at the surface level seems ironic, because they have to be funny all the time and cheery and jolly, but they had some terrible upbringing, like Chevy Chase, for example, who he comes from a rich family, but he was treated like shit when he was a kid, and he was put in the closet and he was beaten and stuff like that, and it's so interesting that some of those people try to deal with trauma in such a public way. In your book, I think it was interesting. You were writing about selling out and how selling out is not necessarily an option for everybody. And it was interesting. You were writing about Inside Llewyn Davis. It's a film that I like very much because I'm a musician myself, and I really did respond to that. And the film surprised me in a way because I didn't expect the Coen brothers to be that sincere,
Hmm.
especially at this late stage in their career. But it was a very sincere film, and I totally got, the journey of Llewyn Davis, and I was very surprised by the compassion the film had for him, because I do think it was a compassionate film, and it had respect for its main character, and just to see there was a guy who just had he was an accomplished artist, but he was just a footnote compared to all those people who came after him, like Bob Dylan and so on. But he was enough, even if the world didn't recognize it. So, and you were talking in your book about this myth that talent will out. At some point you might realize maybe not. But is that a bad thing? Because as you were mentioning, what happens when you get when you get recognized? Maybe it does something to you that your former self, your younger self wouldn't necessarily like.
Hmm.
I had an acquaintance who worked with celebrities at a PR agency or something, and she said it's the B and C list people. They are the worst. Not even the big ones, but the smaller ones. The people who you might think are more accessible, but they were far worse. That's so interesting that when you might be a very chill guy. I don't know if you're George Clooney or someone because
Because you can be.
yeah, you can be. You're allowed to be, but then there are some B-list people who just have to make sure they get treated just as good.
Yeah.
And if they don't, that's a problem. It's going to be a problem. This seems to be part of the game, that you have to bow in front of certain people in order to make your way up in the game. That's what I realized. And in cinephile circles, this is a thing. Some directors are gods. They're literally gods, and they can't do anything wrong.
Kubrick was the reason I focused on Kubrick for a whole book was because of this, because he's the most worshipped of directors, and he's the one that I least appreciate as directors. At least the contrast was the strongest. There's plenty of filmmakers that I think were overrated, but nothing like Kubrick. And one of the things that came clear to me with Kubricophilia is that it's success by association or status by association. This is how these false ceremony masters or cult leaders are created, because people want proximity to greatness, and so there's a narcissism. There's a sort of complementary narcissism in the idolization of a figure, insofar as people who love Kubrick feel that they're a special class of people who appreciate greatness, or whoever it is. It's not just Kubrick, and it's not just artists who are overrated or of pulling a con job, as I write about in the Kubrick Con, a very elaborate and sophisticated con job, but nonetheless a con job. this could be, it can be true of anything, and then it can happen to the artist without their consent, without their compliance, without their collaboration, or even after they die. Cults get created around artists, and I think, well, because we're in a culture where it's more and more, there's this credit that comes from creating cultural greats, and of course, as a fan, you're helping to create the greatness of a figure. You're certainly helping to make them rich and make them famous, right? Because you're one of the cogs in that machine. It didn't used to be like that, and certainly there's many of the artists we admire now, or would if we weren't too confused to know who to trust, weren't particularly famous or successful in their time. And there's extreme examples like Kafka and Van Gogh who had no recognition. And like one of my last receptacles of admiration is Dostoevsky. Like I still have this very strong admiration and affection and nostalgia for Dostoevsky. Well, he was recognized just in the last he was recognized very young, and then he was sent off to Siberia, right? And almost he thought he was going to be shot, and then he was sent to Siberia, and then he wrote the four great novels, and he experienced some major recognition in the last couple of years of his life, but he wasn't, like Crime and Punishment wasn't seen as a great novel when he wrote it. It made him some money and so on. But I'm just using him as a slightly random example, or not random to me. But I can't remember what point I was making, but I know there's another point that's related, which is something you were making about how if we are successful we might turn into something we didn't want to turn into. Well, I'm pretty much at the point where I think I can recognize that what has allowed me to maintain whatever edge I've managed to maintain, where I'm still really trying to get to the truth of something by writing, and that's my incentive, that's my motivation, that's only true insofar as I haven't had the recognition that I was trying to get, right? Because, well, a couple of things. One of the things is that what was driving me for all those decades was trying to get recognition, right? So if I'd got recognition, I would have been less driven, and then I would have been motivated to try and maintain or increase my success, and therefore I would have had a different focus, either than getting recognition that I didn't have, or than trying to get to the truth. But then in the interim, in this period, I've been burning away the egoic drive to be validated and to recognize, because eventually, it's like anything, if you give up something for long enough, or if you can't have it for long enough, you burn up the desire to have it, right? You just run out of energy. So a certain part of me it's like a hamster on a wheel. It's just been running, trying to recognize me, decade after decade, and it's pretty much half dead at this point, because one gets used to not being recognized, and one starts to live with it. It's okay, right? And this has gone parallel with the internet culture, in which anyone and everyone can become a celebrity. So it's so obviously not a meritocracy. Like, it's so palpably obvious now that somebody with 100,000 this, that and the other is they've got no, I don't know what criteria to put it into, really, because cultural legacy isn't necessarily a good criteria, but no real significance, I would say. There's just a flash in the pan. Everything's the latest fad. And it's algorithms as well, right? We don't know what's making somebody appear popular. A lot of it may just not be algorithms, but bots, a combination of algorithms and bots. So we're seeing more and more the artificiality of the way cultural significance is manufactured. That was a side point. So we're finishing the point I was making, that it's allowed a stripping away, right? My lack of success and recognition has allowed a stripping away of the drive to get recognized, and thereby a stripping down to the primary drive, which is difficult to talk about, but I could just say to get to the truth. Now, to me that has spiritual and religious connotations, but we don't have to get into that. It certainly began with Seen and Not Seen. I said that's the first book I wrote, not counting Paper Tiger, where the sense really was I need to get to the truth of who I am, as compared to get to the truth of the world, or find out which movie's better than which movie. It isn't cultural analysis primarily, seen and not seen. It's primarily a self-excavation process. Potentially that process, well, it certainly gets deeper and deeper the more it proceeds, but potentially it also gets more and more, well, closer and closer to the pastry, let's say. Like, what is it we're digging to get to? If we keep on digging, we will get closer and closer and closer. So potentially, what I'm trying to get to here is that an artist who isn't particularly recognised, I've just used the term artist, but whatever we're going to call this, who isn't particularly recognised, who learns not to do it in order to get the recognition, is going to maintain the drive and even increase the drive, primary drive, which is to get to the bottom of something, and might actually get to the bottom of it. And then, who knows? I mean, what significance does that have for the culture? Well, I'm very sceptical about the culture being anything other than a necessary evil or an inevitable side product of something else that's happening, evolutionary or spiritually. But anyway, the culture does exist, and I do have a sort of vague idea that I'm leaving a kind of legacy, even though I think we're almost at the end of history, but I don't know, that might be an illusion. But at the very least, I've left, and it's true while I'm alive, I've left, I'm thinking Stations of the Cross, actually, that would be a nice analogy, a series of monuments or landmarks that show my path, including all the wrong turns I took, or maybe especially the wrong turns. But it's all, like, somebody could read all my books and listen to all my content, and there would be a developmental curve of self-awareness and self-knowledge that they would experience, unlike, well, we could go back to Dave McGowan, right? That's not happening. There isn't a sense of a soul that's uncovering the truth about itself. And to me, if there isn't that sense, well, I'm not sure that it can have value. There has to be a deeper drive than just, joining dots and trying to get people to notice the patterns.
I guess when you stay with your subject, when you try to follow the evidence, there's still value in that if you do good work. But with McGowan, I just have the impression he's had this accomplished worldview. He knows how the world works, and then he just lays it all out for you. And so, as you said, there's no journey there. There's just pattern recognition, and pattern recognition can go either way. Doesn't really matter, and that's the problem. And I like this quality about seen and not seen. This searching, this aspect of searching, because I still have that, and I'm going crazy sometimes because I thought I used to have an identity, I am this guy and I'm going to be that guy. But now I'm like, I don't know who I am. I know that I have some roles. I'm a father, I'm a husband, I work for a living, and I do some research. I'm a musician, but that's not really my identity, and I don't know if I have any, and I don't even know if you need one, you know. But it's so interesting because back in the day, I thought I had one. I thought I knew who I am and what I was going to do with my life. Is that really necessary to have this full formed identity, or is that even possible? Is that even possible? And movies used to help me provide that identity, and filmmakers and directors and writers. And I thought, when I grow up, I'm going to be David Rayfield. The guy that Sidney Pollack used to call when he had problems with the scripts. Mostly he was uncredited, but he was like a pro and he got paid well. And he was like this guy in the shadows who was very important. And I thought to myself, I want to be David Rayfield, but I can't be. because this part of Hollywood is gone. Everyone is just everyone gets treated bad, more or less. And if you're not part of the club, you don't get to have a privileged position anyway. Now I'm working on an experimental feature film myself. So, but this is just for me. This is because I owe it to me, to make one thing.
Yeah, funny, I did
Just
that last year. I made a film. It was a short, uh, based on a script I wrote 10 years before, and that was also my reasoning, really. Like, let's just do it this one time. I did make a film in 2001, but it really didn't, or 2003. It really didn't work. So I thought I'll try it one more time. Anyway, and one thing I did experience, I wasn't directing it because I felt I wanted to find somebody else to do that. I didn't really see eye to eye with the director, so it was part of the problem. But it was a reasonably enjoyable few days shooting it. But one thing that it really brought home, I suppose, not being the director, was the artificiality of it. It felt just so unnatural to come in and have a script and have actors read the lines, and just the whole thing felt somehow, I won't say anti-life because that's putting it too strongly, but artificial, by definition artificial. I did get the sense, rightly or wrongly, that the process of filmmaking had a sort of inverse relationship to naturalness. In other words, the more natural things were on the set, the less good it would be as a film, and vice versa. Now, I don't think not all films are made this way, the Kubrick way, but he's certainly, he's the exemplary filmmaker now for a reason, I think, and he was all about artificiality and control. I know there are counterexamples that are the opposite and do improvise and spontaneity and stuff. I recently watched Mean Streets, and I absolutely loved it. And I can't say that about any other Scorsese film at this point. Like even Taxi Driver, I feel a bit ambivalent about, but Mean Streets really felt absolutely full of life to me as a film. So it certainly is possible. But that film was, Scorsese was really trying to bring a camera into his own life to a large degree. It was almost documentary realism, even though it's scripted, and so it can be done, but then it leads to something else. Anyway, so my experience, it wasn't like that at all. I think I probably could enjoy making a film again. I probably won't, but if it was more in an improvisatory thing and having the right group of people who really felt some vitality in being together and had a shared vision and so on and so forth, I think there's a huge potential for that. And that was my other aim with making a film, was could I bring people together as a team in a way that was going to be meaningful and soulful and would lead to something else. Well, I couldn't, actually. I mean, I found decent enough actors and competent enough technicians, but we worked together sufficiently well to create the product, but there definitely wasn't the so-called synergy whereby we're definitely going to continue this relationship, and that didn't happen. And that, to me, I think that's the purpose of all life, actually, is to find our connections and to deepen and develop them, and to discover ways to actually become maybe not actually become, but to sort of hypothetically or symbolically become a kind of meta-organism, to really see what human beings can do if they work together at a deeper level. I think that film has that potential, but I don't know if it will ever be realised. I don't know if it's relevant, actually, to me now, like making films. Except in the way that you said for yourself. Like, if you have a drive or an incentive or a goal that's been running your software or part of your software for a period, there is a feeling of needing to just find out what it would be like, I think, before letting go of it.
Yeah, I mean, the last couple of years, I tried to, when you're talking about this in the book, to deprogram myself. And it leads me to my next question. How do you deprogram yourself, and what does it actually mean? Because for me, I think one important part is to step back, to step aside. When I became a father and, priorities shifted, and that was kind of a traumatic experience at first, I must admit, because it was before that, it was all about me and my projects and, the ego and I have to do this because this is so important. But then it all changed, and and the ego has to wrestle with that, because it's not the most important thing all of a sudden.
Mm.
And yeah, what do you do with that? But it's important, and after a while, it just when you gain this distance from your obsessions, you have a different relationship to them, and maybe they won't be obsessions anymore. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe they become something else.
Yeah.
It's difficult for me because I was always looking for some fixture in life, and there was this one bizarre thought that I had in my 20s. I thought the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the most horrifying movie I've ever seen, and I want it to stay that way for me. I want to have this feeling. I want it to have with me forever. I don't want this to go away. And this is so bizarre to me when I think about it.
What feeling did you want to not go away?
I guess it's this feeling when I was watching it, it gripped me in a certain way. I was in a very weird state. And I had that with a couple of movies that I don't have anymore. It was like a kind of a re-traumatization, because I wanted to be shaken. I wanted to be stirred up.
Hmm.
And
So intensity, the feeling
and
of intensity.
it's not only intensity, because you can have that when you watch some, I don't know, some very violent film. I could watch a Sam Peckinpah film or something like that, and that is very intense, but it's not the feeling that I was looking for. Maybe it was, and of course you're writing about this, to be in a kind of a womb where it's equally terrifying and safe.
Mm.
And
Contrast, yeah. Well,
yeah,
that's potentially rather than re-traumatization, it is potentially reenacting a trauma and thereby healing it. And here we would come back to this question: is art that is apparently evil, can it also be good? I mean, can it flip back again? We think it's good, and now we think it's evil. Can it then flip back to good again? So, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which of course is one of the subjects of Seen and Not Seen, because of how intense it is and how much it impacted me. I saw that movie quite young, actually, at a cinema in London. Anyway, the first time. And I do think it's a work of art. You put that in quotes if you want, but it is a strange work of art, and obviously inseparable from it being effective as a work of art is how horrific it is. But it's not horrific in the sense of being gory. Like there aren't things that, like I watched Weapons last night, which is actually, I thought, probably the best movie I saw from last year, and I didn't see many movies, but it was certainly the only conventionally Hollywood kind of movie I've seen in feels like years that I enjoyed. But it was so violent, certain scenes, and it was completely unnecessary. I mean, people's heads being crushed and things like that. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, on the other hand, doesn't show very much at all. Yeah, there's a woman being hung on a meat hook, which obviously is horrifically violent, but there you don't actually see any flesh being pierced and so on. Feel a bit weird, I think, talking about this topic, because it clearly, as a point I made in my first book, Blood Poets, that even if we're not going to argue that this kind of violence makes the world a worse place, clearly, if the world wasn't the way it is, we wouldn't feel a need for this kind of violence. Clearly, the fact that a film like Texas Chainsaw Massacre affects us as deeply as it does is an indication that something is wrong. Right? This is really essential. It just gets completely swept off the table in whatever discussions there still are about the morality of film violence. And an idiot like Tarantino, who just completely dismisses the whole idea that film violence is bad for you, which itself is ridiculous because we are mimetic. But point I'm making is it leaves entirely unaddressed why on earth people would want to have their nervous systems jangling around like they were actually on in Guantanamo Bay by watching a movie. Like, what is it in us that responds to that kind of experience? That's a really necessary question that doesn't get asked, and it, as far as I see, it has to do with early trauma. Like, there's something already in our nervous system. There's a charge that is oppressing us and tormenting us already at a subconscious level, and so when we see a movie that stimulates certain responses in us, it essentially reactivates that charge. We start re-experiencing the terror that's already in our body, and yet we know cognitively we're safe. So that is potentially that is the psychotherapeutic process, catharsis for the Greeks, whereby we get triggered, but we know that whatever we're feeling is not life-threatening, even though it feels life-threatening, because we're in the psychotherapeutic process, and so we have enough self-awareness to say, wait a minute, don't take this seriously, don't react, just let the feelings come up and see where they go and clear them out. Potentially, that could be what a film like Texas Chainsaw Massacre allows for. I mean, I think it's kind of almost absurd to say it because of what it actually has led to, which is things like hostel and torture porn and the whole cultural trends that didn't begin with Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Maybe they began with Psycho, but that was a watershed moment, right, that pushed the envelope and led to all these other developments. And there's really nothing benign or even harmless about this, right, as a cultural phenomenon. And yet, at an individual level, I think it is possible that something good can come of it.
And I think, like you said, there's two sides, and I think the film itself, I do think it's a work of art, and it does. I think it's a film about America in some sense, and a film about America in those days. But it's what culture does with it. You know, the capitalist framework, for example, there had to be a sequel. You know, you have to make a franchise out of it, and then you have to trivialize it. Something that used to be meaningful becomes a gimmick, and it becomes a gag, and it eventually turns into hostile and what have you. I think that's the thing. I don't think a film like Texas Chainsaw Massacre is per se harmful, but it's what culture does with it. You know, it gets swept away, and it becomes the whole horror culture in the US. It's so weird to me because it seems to celebrate the commodification of trauma in a certain sense and makes entertainment out of it. So one film is not harmful, but when I don't know, when it becomes like a matrix of of those kinds of films, and you don't really have time to process, you just have time to consume one after another, and you get desensitized and so on.
Well, that's maybe what you were referring to, is that in you had this desire to live in that movie or to keep re-experiencing it, that yes, it becomes harmful because people have that intense experience and they misinterpret it. They don't understand that something is processing, and if they go with that, there'll be a very different outcome, as opposed to just wanting to re-experience it. So they see the movie over and over again, or they look for sequels or similar kind of movies, which there aren't any actually. There's nothing like that particular movie, which maybe is a clue in and of itself. It's a kind of one-off. But I would say that actually it's not so much that one film can't be harmful, it's that even things that are potentially harmful can be used for a benefit. So if you think of homeopathic remedies, they often involve things that are poisonous if they're in larger doses. or any kind of natural medicine, actually, herbal medicines. Generally, those plants would be harmful if they were taken in too large doses. So I think that analogy is pretty close, that the efficacy of a film like Texas Chainsaw Massacre for some sort of psychic purging or confrontation of one's own trauma or catharsis, etc., is inseparable from the fact that it is attacking our nervous system, and therefore it is harmful, but the harm can actually be beneficial, let's say. I mean, initiation rituals, not that I'm advocating them, they were physically harmful and dangerous and so on. And the thing with Texas Chainsaw Massacre that has to be addressed is that the movie was traumatizing for the actress. Like, she was so badly treated in that film. Admittedly, she consented, but this isn't a moral question. Well, maybe it is, but I'm not bringing it up as a moral point. But the efficacy of the film and what made it so brutally realistic is inseparable from the fact that that actress was in pain and bleeding and probably quite frightened as well. So although she was complicit, nonetheless, some of the terror that we're receiving or feeling watching the film is real. Right? It's not a snuff movie, but still. So it's very primitive and primal, really. And I think films are essentially their primal experiences. Talking about in the womb, like whatever nightmares we might have in the womb, and certainly as children. So yeah, we're talking about a technology, I call it in the book, don't I, technology of dissociation, that is so profoundly powerful, like the nuclear bomb, that there's kind of no way that it's not going to be misused and abused. And if there isn't a corresponding, well, this is a cliche, isn't it? Like, if we don't develop morally and in terms of awareness in tandem with, in proportion to the technological developments, we're accelerating our own self-destruction. That's the cliche, but I wanted to apply it to film. Like, film is a technology that required a vastly an equivalent increase, evolution of our awareness and our moral sense in order to use it wisely, and it just didn't happen.
It's interesting that you mentioned weapons because I saw it in the theater. It was so interesting because some of the nightmarish imagery of the film did remind me of some of the nightmares that I had as a child. That was quite weird. It was like the movie was in my head, literally. And when I was younger, I don't think I don't think I could have taken it. There were images that I dreamt of and that haunted me for years, and I saw them in the film. I do think that I had enough distance to I don't know, to just be interested by that and be curious about that and not be that much affected.
Mm.
And I think that's a good thing. But it reminded me of the power that film actually has. And like you said, it can be used for pernicious purposes. I think the way culture treats movies is not helpful because, the supposed progressive people tend to think that art must be allowed to do everything. There can't be any boundaries. You can't limit yourself. You can't censor yourself, even though everybody does. That's the point of Western society. We censor ourselves, but not in terms of violence, in terms of certain topics that we are allowed to discuss or not.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, like vaccines. If you're a documentary filmmaker and you want to succeed in this world, you don't make a documentary about vaccines. You don't make a documentary about COVID. You don't make a documentary about certain conspiracies. And you don't want to make a documentary about mass media because people don't take it seriously anymore. They think the media is everywhere and we have mastered it. I mean, I think this is the sense that I get. And Peter Watkins, the filmmaker who recently died, he was talking about this, that people learn about the craft, but they don't learn about the responsibility that you have as a filmmaker and what it actually does to your mind. I mean, he was making those, reenactment films in order to show us that every film is fiction, every film is manipulation. and can be used in that way and will be used in that way. And he wanted to show his films and then have, like a 2 to 3 hour discussion about them. And nobody, film festivals, they can't allow that, because you don't have the time. It's also strictly timed. So you can show a film, then you can have a discussion which lasts about 15 minutes, and then you go on to the next one. And you don't really have time to process that. And he was always opposed to that. So, and he got fed up with the whole business and he didn't want to show his films anymore because he thought there's no opportunity to discuss the work and to discuss the technique of documentary filmmaking and what it actually does. And I do think that people underestimate the power of film, the power of editing. They take it for granted and they do think they understand everything and they can't fall for manipulation. They think manipulation is something that the Russians do or the Chinese or the North Koreans. But if we did it, we would be aware of that. And this is, of course, the first trap.
Well, my main reservation, about the only, but about still watching media, besides that, I would like to just not want to. I mean, I just feel it would be freeing up time for other things, or more than time is attention, really. And maybe this is inseparable from what I'm going to say. It just has to do with, well, it's diet. It's the equivalent of a psychic diet. So, and I even do sometimes eat junk food when I watch a movie, right? Some crisps or some chocolate, what have you. I mean, they go well together, right? So, and I know, I mean, that is trying to recreate the womb state, really. It's almost a literal thing. It's suffused in a external reality or a surrogate reality, and you're being fed at the same time. Also, we're imbibing. Just as we're imbibing comfort food in order to make us feel good in some essentially contrived and artificial way, we're imbibing the movie, even if it's weapons or Texas Chainsaw Massacre, even if it's disturbing. That doesn't matter because as long as it's effective, is the thing. And often a movie needs to be disturbing and violent and intense in order to be effective, partly because the extremity of our lives, right, requires something equally extreme to distract us. So the whole thing of wanting to be distracted, I think, is problematic, wanting to dissociate, but we do that every night when we sleep and dream, so it's still definitely part of our natural functioning process, is to check out and to go into these surrogate realities. However, when we dream, at least as far as we know, and this is questionable, I think that the dreams are organically created. I was going to say we create them, but that's a whole metaphysical question because they may come from outside of us. But as far as we know, they're not coming from technology and media and corporations. I think that's also a question mark. They might be, but that's a whole other topic. With movies, we know for sure that they're coming from corporations with agendas and with associations and affiliations that we've touched upon as a form of propaganda. And the best movies are the best propaganda. I wrote this about Mindhunter in 16 Months Hell. That's high-level propaganda. I watched this movie over Christmas called Warfare, which is co-directed by Alex Garland, who I thought did the worst kind of propaganda, like Civil War. It's just unwatchable. But this Warfare is an excellent movie. It's realism, and it doesn't seem to glorify the Iraq War at all. But clearly it's propaganda, right? It was made and it was funded and it's serving its purpose. So yeah, that's something that's high-level propaganda. Like the best visual media content is also the best propaganda because it's the subtlest and it's the most effective. It's not Top Gun. Propaganda that you can see is propaganda. You just either turn it off or you kind of laugh at it. It's when it's actually getting into your system and persuading you that this is art and that this is realism and so on. Ironically, talking about documentaries, as I wean myself off the movies and the TV shows, I moved to documentaries, and I only watch documentaries. But who's to say that they're less pernicious because they claim to be true? It's just that they're less addictive. I don't escape so much into a documentary.
Right.
But the main thing I was trying to get to is, what am I doing to my consciousness by continually topping up the imagery and the sensations and the affect, the emotions and whatnot that are coming from this media that otherwise would be getting filled up by other things. I mean, you asked this question I didn't answer. How do we deprogram ourselves? Well, of course, one obvious way is you stop adding new programs, right? You stop watching new programs, which in a way is the simplest. You just turn off the TV, but it might also be the hardest. And you're also talking about obsession, and there can be a tendency, it's what we call a dry drunk, is to get obsessed with getting clear of an obsession, by which we perpetuate the thing. You can just use an act of will and say, never more, I won't watch any of this stuff, but then you're still thinking about it, or you're creating an identity thereby that is the identity that is above these things and rejects these things. So it's much subtler than that, but nonetheless, clearly one major step is not to keep adding to the program or keep updating the programming. However, there is a blurry line there, because you can watch stuff in a discerning way that is deprogramming, maybe. Even if you watch new stuff, you're seeing it with ever new eyes, and you're training your eyes to recognize. And so potentially, I can't think of what an example is here, but maybe like you're part of a cult. Well, leaving the cult might not be enough. You might need to actually stay in the cult so that you can see the ways in which it was programming you, and leave gradually in this way. Otherwise, you might just end up in another cult, right, that you think is helping you get from the previous cult, get out from it. So that seems a reasonable analogy. But to me, the main means of deprogramming it's like overwriting a text. I think we need to find ways of engaging our consciousness that, although they might not be ever as compelling and as satisfying emotionally as watching movies is, they nonetheless do really take our attention, but are wholesome. Now, so there's a spectrum there, which includes things that are quite onerous. So for me, like having a vineyard and having to prune the plants sometime soon, I'm going to have to spend hours and hours pruning these plants. I'll probably be listening to podcasts where I do it when I do it, but probably my own podcast, so that'll be all right. But the thing is I'm physically and mentally engaged in something that is ancient tradition. Human beings have been doing it for hundreds of years. It's part of nature. It's a cooperation with nature, spending time with goats, walking in nature, swimming. There's all kinds of obvious things we could say. And then I'm reading an awful lot about the Bible. Well, that's culturally distracting, but at least it feels more purposeful. I'm not just escaping into somebody else's fantasies. I'm trying to work something out. I think that seems to be the main thing. They say this about drug addicts as well. The main thing isn't to get off the drug, it's to find new forms of satisfaction and of meaning to, I don't want to say reprogram because we're not machines, but it is like reconditioning. We're reconditioning our responses so that they become less and less programmed, as in we've been conditioned. This is a problem that I'm still thinking about. Like, our aesthetic responses are conditioned into us by our early experiences. So to me, Jaws will always be a great movie, but I have to admit that I can't really be objective about that, because I saw Jaws when I was 7. So it was one of the first movies that really gave me a sense of what a movie is. I think it is objectively a great movie, but what does that even mean, right? And we're back on this question, is the value, is the virtue, is the value in great art? In Jaws, probably not really. I don't know it has any really deeply meaningful things except human camaraderie or something like that. But The point is that insofar as our aesthetic responses have been conditioned from a very young age, it's very difficult to recondition them. And clearly, the solution isn't just watching better movies, right? Even if we could, we can't. They're not making movies like Jaws anymore, right? So then it's, well, I guess more classic forms of art, which is challenging. I mean, I have finally got into the Book of Genesis. I'm finally finding some really rich enjoyment in reading and understanding the Book of Genesis. Not a lot of the Old Testament, the Book of Job, and the New Testament, and then reading about these things. Oh yeah, the classical art. So art used to have a moral. It used to have a moral, I don't want to say agenda, context. This was about, art was inseparable from deepening our moral sense of what's real and what's true and what's good and what's beautiful. Beautiful being, I think that art has degenerated so that only beauty was left, I think, and then even beauty has been expunged in the last 50 years or more, and now it's just this so-called authenticity, although that's entirely questionable actually, because modern concept art, there's nothing authentic about that. So you could say even authenticity's been thrown out, but in most average artistic taste now, there's certainly at least the sense that you're saying about there's no censorship, it's got to be an authentic expression. That's probably the last residue, I think, of something of value in art. Like Weapons was a good film because even though it was a horrific fantasy movie, it was realistic on its level. And most movies I try to watch now, or TV shows, I can't make it 5 minutes because there's just nothing credible about it, whether it's because it's messaging about race or sexuality, or it's just simply incompetent, or both. They usually go together. I cannot suspend my disbelief. So in that sense, the art form's sabotaging itself and making it easier and easier to not imbibe this stuff unless we keep rewatching old shows. But yeah, occasionally there's a film like Weapons or Warfare or Eddington, which A is competent, B is addressing relevant stuff. I mean, Weapons is a bit questionable, but there's something in there I think that was meaningful, and C is realistic or convincing. It persuades us that we're in this other world and we want to be there. But that, to finish the point I was making, that's the problem with art, is that we want to be in another world rather than this world. And this world is problematic, needless to say, but it is embedded in the natural world, and the natural world is the creation of divine forces. It's reality itself. So I think that finally that's the only, or at least that's the final and most essential stage of deprogramming, is to start returning to a natural way of being and being willing to, I mean, you're becoming a father. You said that was a turning point, and it was quite traumatic. You even said, well, that's it, that's nature, pulling the rug out from under everything else. Your ego, or your false ego, can't really navigate that reality. It can't get what it wants anymore in the way that it wanted it. Well, it's true if you're herding goats. It's true if you're trying to maintain a vineyard. Anything that's natural and that human beings have been doing for thousands of years, because that's what God intended, is going to throw a spanner into our culturally engineered identities.
I think Weapons also works because it is a film about grief, and I think you can sense it because the director, he was part of a comedy group, and he lost his friend. Zach Cregger lost Trevor Moore, who was kind of a conspiracy-pilled guy. Of course, there were some theories that said they killed him because he made fun of the Bush family and so on. There are even theories that said Zach Cregger sacrificed him in order to become part of the club, which is such a great theory and also very tasteless. I mean, this is another example of, the conspiracy mind. If you don't stop it, it just keeps on and on and on, and it becomes quite destructive. And everything becomes a psyop. Everything is pernicious. Everything is becomes a message of evil. But I think it's interesting you mentioned beauty and ugliness in art, because I think that's one of the traps. Andy Warhol, when he made art, when he just proclaimed these things to be art just because he said so and made it commercial in a way it was never before, that wasn't good for culture, at all. I think we lost a sense of direction in art. The sense of beauty, that the old masters had, for example, it's lost to us. I mean, there are many reasons for that. I mean, we invented photography, so we don't have to master the arts anymore, and we invented film. But still, I think Andy Warhol blurred the lines in a way no one did it before, and the ugliness became sort of a virtue in itself, even become celebrated by the media, and all those lost souls that he collected along the way, they became heroes. What does this even mean?
I mean, there is again, there's not ambiguity, but it's not cut and dried here, because if you think of someone like David Lynch, that aesthetic in Eraserhead, you could say that was beautifying the ugly. Like, he loved factories and pollution, but he wasn't wrong. Like, that imagery, the way that he approached it, and his cinematographer, it did make something beautiful out of something that is ugly if we're just there, unless we're David Lynch, so we don't see the potential in it for some sort of visual dramatic effect. And so this is a very blurry line. Like the film that I made last year, my sister complained in the script because she said it was full of ugliness, because I had things like focusing on one black hair on a bar of soap, and the guy was belching and farting a lot, and I had a lot of attention given to physical, biological facts of life, right? Because I think, well, they are facts of life, and that, I mean, that was a Lynchian aesthetic that I wanted to emulate, but it's not only David Lynch. That it does seem to me, and this is certainly something I've had since my 20s, which I can't really separate from cultural propaganda, really, postmodern or what have you, or Nietzsche. I don't know what would I'd have to think about where I would trace it back to, which is a kind of redemptive desire, or at least pseudo-redemptive, to find the beautiful in the ugly, to transform things through art, which to me is, I mean, potentially that is truly redemptive, I think. At least I'm not clear about it. I'm a little confused. So I haven't talked about it before. At least I don't remember talking about it. I mean, Raskolnikov, Crime and Punishment. That's a horrific story, and it's tragic, and it's painful, and it's violent, and all the rest of it. But it is a beautiful work of art, and the novel that has most influenced me, and it gave me a very profound affinity for not just Dostoevsky but for Raskolnikov. Did that make me want to be a murderer? No. Did that make me more morally relativistic about murder? No, I don't think it did. It does potentially, it could be the thin end of a kind of liberal progressive wedge, which is like, well, all criminals are just victims and so on. But I don't think that was the point that Dostoevsky was making at all. Raskolnikov wasn't a victim of his circumstances. He was a victim of very bad ideas that he fed, and then he was a victim of his own conscience, if you will, as in his own conscience caused him to suffer terribly because of what he'd done. So it is a moral novel, but its focus is ugliness and crime. So what's going on there? I mean, it's not clear. It's complicated. I mean, this whole question is complicated, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Eraserhead is also a film about becoming a father and about it becoming a traumatic experience in some ways. It's interesting because, Antonioni basically tried the same things with the industrial landscapes in the Red Desert. And he also tried to find the beauty in it. He wasn't trying to show the ugliness of it, but the beauty, which is understandable and disturbing at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I can relate to David Lynch more because he does have his own aesthetic. And Eraserhead is a very vulnerable film and it just shows in what state he was back in the day, and he had marital problems, and there wasn't any money, and he was trying to get by. He was a starving artist, and you can sense it in the film. It's a very honest and disturbing film. And it could have gotten nowhere, if Mel Brooks hadn't seen it, and
Yeah.
had given him the chance to make The Elephant Man. I
That's
guess,
the official story, yeah.
if it's true, yes.
Yeah, well, I mean, back to this larger topic, right? Because I don't think that somebody is necessarily wrong if they're going to argue or use the phrase that, in this case, David Lynch, the AFI and all that, that there was some conscious agenda there to employ or to select and to develop David Lynch as an agent of cultural engineering, even though actually to the end David Lynch was kind of an outlier. So he is an interesting case study. But certainly it's plausible to me that there are these underlying and overriding supercultural agendas, and that anyone we've heard of has somehow been co-opted into them. That is my worldview. That's the irony. I said to Dalrymple, I do basically probably agree with what you're saying here. It's just the way that you're saying it, and the way that it's being used and applied, and the things it leads to. That's where I question it, because at the end of the day, it's just my opinion. Whereas he's arguing, no, we can all agree on that. The jury's out now. We know this is the case. Well, no, we don't. It's too subtle. I don't want to repeat myself. So there's this thing of always trying to find some firm ground to stand on. That's the temptation that needs to be resisted, I think. So Dave McGowan could be right. The conclusions that he's making with weird scenes in the canyon, and that are leading him to frame all that evidence in a way that's unconvincing to you and I, doesn't mean he's wrong.
That's true.
But he hasn't earned it, and he hasn't proved it. Like, his conviction isn't earned, and it's not established. Therefore, I would say that the work is more than flawed, and potentially does more harm than good, ironically, even though we're not talking about a big Hollywood production. But that's maybe a point to make, is that this responsibility of art and artists that are corporate backed and funded and all the rest of it, it has to apply to the smallest player on the chessboard, just the small fry like us who are just doing a podcast. That's really the only way to address the problem, is by addressing it in ourselves. There is a huge responsibility in being alive and communicating and trying to make claims about what's true and what's false and what's good and what's evil. We can't not do it. I think maybe this is sort of the point I was trying to get to with David Lynch, is the two things. An artist who's struggling to express his soul and connect to the spirit and all the good things is not mutually exclusive from a psychological operation. It just isn't. Like you can't have psychological operations without these genuinely driven, soulful artists. They are the cogs in the machine. It's so ironic and it's so tragic, but that it just may be the nature of the world. Like the world is what it is, and that the individuals in it who are trying to get free of the system and trying to uninstall it from their own psyches and get back to a natural way of being, using art as among other things to do it. I mean, this is all true of religion as well, what we're talking about, and science and the other disciplines. They're always going to be in danger of being co-opted, and it's such a tricky, like, how do you choose? If somebody is offering you money to realize your vision, you genuinely believe that's going to actually facilitate this process that is genuinely good in its inception, then you take the money. I mean, it's going to be very hard to resist that.
I mean, it's like John Ford and John Wayne, doing those anti-communist movies. They thought that's a good thing for democracy.
Yeah.
Even doing it clandestinely. I'm sure they weren't necessarily evil people. I'm not very sympathetic towards John Wayne, but I think he was a simple guy and he just thought This is like a public service that I'm providing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so too. Simpleton, and relatively. But that's, I mean, that's the good intentions and the road to hell.
That's exactly it. And yeah, even yeah, like with Dave McGowan, I'm sure he had very good intentions. I think he was probably a good guy. Yeah, like you said, the work is flawed, and I think it makes for some difficult shortcuts. And I don't think that's very good for research in general. Still, he inspired also very good people. He inspired people to do further research on these topics, and
Yeah.
that's of course a good thing. It's so I still wrestle with him in a way, and I do think he did inspire Eye of the Chicken Hawk, which is for me is a better book because it comes with the sources, with the receipts, and it's much more plausible in its arguments, I think.
Yeah, I haven't read that one. Somebody recommended it. It's a very off-putting title, I have to say.
Yeah, and it's not edited well. It didn't have any editing. It's self-published, so that's a shame because it many people will not read it because of that. Because for them, it's a red flag if a book is not really edited and it has some grammatical errors. But the arguments are very well put. And I do think it's a very good book. And the guy is on Twitter, and I think he's very smart. That's just my impression, and I can't verify everything that he says because he's very out there and he's very deep in his topics. But he's very good.
Well, maybe I should look into it if he's still active then.
By the way, how come you did publish with 0 books?
Yeah, good question. How did that happen? It was before Doug Lane took over as well, or he took over right at the time it was published, and that was partly why it never went anywhere, I think, because in the transition, but also it wasn't a book that I don't think Doug Lane appreciated as a book, and we had a falling out soon after that. So how did it happen to me is just, 0 Books is part of John Hunt, which is part of that large online service, or rather that is John Hunt, isn't it? The online service where you can submit to all these different imprints. So it was just, I was just trying all these different publishers, and I didn't even know that 0 Books was quite reputable at the time. It just seems doubly ironic, actually, that it's one of my least read books, if not the least read, and yet it's one that has the most reputable publisher that usually gets reviewed by The Guardian and things like that. It's kind of typical. It's a microcosm of I don't know what it is. I mean, everyone's talking about being shadow banned these days, but I can tell you it doesn't take algorithms for somebody to be shadow banned, because my whole writing career is testimony to it. Because I get endorsement from Pauline Kael, and it doesn't make any difference. Well, it's strange. It's mysterious. You would think it would be fairly mechanical, in the sense you could see, well, if you get this person on your side, or you get this review, or so on, then things will happen. But based on either I'm just perennially cup half empty and I'm just never satisfied and I don't appreciate the success I've had, or I simply have just never had success, even though, I mean, you could say getting Pauline Kael to read and like my book, that is a huge success. It's true, but the fact it doesn't translate into anything social, I think is, I don't know what it is. I think it suggests that, because Pauline Kael is clearly in the club, whatever the club is, she's the most reputable film critic of the 20th century, which means ever, who ever lived. As far as being in the club, it's not about necessarily who you know or what you've done in terms of compromises and things like that, or even how willing you are to sell out, although this would be closer to being related. I think it has to do with the McLuhan thing of the medium being the message. So what is your brain state, and is your brain state compatible with the Borgian mind that wants to assimilate you? Like Philip K. Dick, he wasn't really assimilated while he was alive. He did get recognition, so I'm not comparing myself to him in that way, because obviously I'm still a relative nobody. But Philip K. Dick is a relative, was a relative somebody while he was alive and working. He won awards and things, but he wasn't as really fully assimilated. He didn't become famous until after he died, really, with Blade Runner and the movies. And he certainly had an anomalous kind of brain, right? And yeah, he was able to make himself somewhat compatible with the culture at large by writing sci-fi. Something I've tried writing novels and I've never managed to publish any, partly for this reason. Like, is there a way I can Trojan horse my way into the culture? And Blood Poets itself was an attempt to Trojan horse, pretty ironic, because I was trying to Trojan horse my paranoid worldview by writing a book about film criticism. Well, a book on film criticism is not likely to conquer the Trojans, right? And I was published by an academic press and probably only printed 500 copies or something. So it was ironic in the sense that the Trojan horse I was using was always going to be marginal anyway. So, but I think this has to do with what your brain state is, or what your incentive is, what your agenda, what your focus is, what your attention is on, and what your goals are. Now, I did have a conscious goal to try and become famous, as you know, as I've written about it, and to try and be successful and popular and all that. But I had this other unconscious goal, which is by definition much deeper and broader and wider, and that was the very opposite of it. And I was aware of it from the start, really, that I was trying to attain worldly success by writing about how the world and the value system of the world was antithetical to goodness or to truth. Like, I never had any illusions about the state of the world, and yet I was completely divided because I wanted somehow to be rewarded by this world. And somebody made a point I read recently, I think it was Stephen DeLay, who I'm talking to next week, a Christian writer, that if you take seriously the gospel and the story of Christ, Jesus, even without being Christian, because I don't identify that way, what it communicates is that somebody of the maximum goodness and honesty gets murdered, then the world is not anything that you want to evaluate your own worth by. You know, getting rewarded and validated and promoted by the world cannot be a good measure of your integrity. If we just refer to the story of Jesus, which obviously is a very old story, but very central one, like the most influential story in the Western world, really, which is a paradox in and of itself. How did Jesus get so popular? But anyway, that's for another conversation. I'm just underscoring this thing about my own trajectory has always been through the world, but not in the world, and out of the world, right? To be not of this world. I've never felt like I was of this world. Talk about autism, and I guess in an autistic frame, and this is what Seen and Not Seen is about. I was trying to cobble together an identity and create an imitation of what I thought the world wanted and what it would reward. And like autists do, I always got it wrong. Because I got it wrong, the world recognized me, but it recognized me as something that it wasn't going to recognize.
Thank you very much, Jason. Thank you for your time. You've been very generous.
Sure, you're welcome. Appreciate it. So I always want to talk about Seen and Not Seen, even if we don't talk about it. It's there in the background. So thanks for reading it and appreciating it.
Well, I do dreams that you would never guess. Dreams that you could never guess.
Flowers die.
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 Dreams that you could never guess. Dreams that you could never guess. Dreams that you could never guess. Dreams that you could never guess.
Stop it! You're ignorant.